Hi there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. In this week's episode, I am going to do something a little different. Consider this the year in review show. What I want to do is share some of the things that I've learned in a year of doing a podcast. I'm going to mention the top 5 episodes of the past 12 months and just generally share a little bit about my experiences doing this weekly podcast and how I see it's kind of fit into my overall work with astrology. So this is definitely different to the usual kind of show. If you are looking for the astrology highlight of the week, which is Mars conjunct Uranus, I talk about that in last week's episode, which is episode 53. In next week's show, I will be talking about the astro highlights for the following 2 weeks. So, I do ask for your indulgence today, I guess, as I take a little look back through the archives and just reflect on what doing this solo podcasting show for a year has been like. What I wanted to share first was a recap of the 5 most popular shows that I have put together in the last 12 months. I have been doing weekly shows, so there are more than 50 to choose from. But here are the 5 shows that you, the listeners, have listened to the most, which tells me they must be the most popular or the most interesting to you all. So the most popular episode that I have done is episode number 44, which is all about the new moon in Taurus. The second most popular episode I've done was episode 40, which was about the dramatic new moon eclipse in Aries. Third on the list of most popular in the last year is episode 42, which was about the full moon in Scorpio. Number 4 on the list was episode 47, which was all about Jupiter and Gemini. And number 5 on the top 5 list of most listened to shows for me in the last year is episode 43, which was about Venus in Taurus and about Mars in Aries. So that's all about a planet in rulership. What I loved when I saw those top 5 episodes and the topics that they were about is that these episodes do cover a mix of topics, from things like a lunation, which might be a new moon or a full moon or even an eclipse. That was definitely the top 3 shows were about those kinds of things. But the next 2 shows were about planets moving into different signs. So the energy of a planet in a different zodiac sign. And I thought that was really interesting that there was a mix of things that you're all curious to listen to. I also wanted to say that if you have any of the placements that I talk about in a show, if you have any of those placements in your birth chart, you might find listening to these past episodes really useful because you may find it helps you better understand that planet sign combination and what it might mean for you. So if you have Jupiter and Gemini, that can be a great episode to go back to. We will have Jupiter and Gemini for 12 months until mid-2025. So that is definitely one that if you haven't got to yet, pop it on your listening list. And then things like if you have Venus in Taurus or you have Mars in Aries, or maybe you have a friend or a family member or a romantic partner that has those placements, as you hear me talking about them in terms of the mood for the week, you might also get some really great gems of insight about what it would be like if somebody has that in their chart, if that's a part of who they are. So I wanted to give a call out to those 5 episodes. Most of you will know about them because most of you have been listening to them. I actually have 3 personal favorite episodes from the last year. And these are 3 episodes that didn't make the listeners' top 5, but I really am quite proud of them. And so I want to share them now. I want to give them a little shout out. So the first of my personal 3 favorite episodes is episode number 30, which is all about Pluto in Aquarius. And that's where I give a kind of a synopsis overview of the themes and vibe of Pluto in Aquarius, which of course is something that we will have for the next 20 years. Episode 27, definitely one of my personal favorites. Episode 27 is about astrology, health, and herbal teas. And this episode was based on an article that I wrote many years ago talking about the different body parts and systems that are connected to each zodiac sign and about some of the herbal teas that can be really soothing or supportive for each sign as well. And so that's a little bit more practical. It's kind of more in the wellness space, but it's using two things I love: astrology and herbal tea. I really love anything that enhances wellness and well being. And so that's a personal favorite episode of mine. So that's episode 27. And finally, another episode which I was really proud of putting together because I just felt like I really covered some good material. This is episode 24, and it's called Working with a Planet in Detriment, Venus in Scorpio. So it's specifically about Venus in Scorpio, but it's also a little bit of a mini teaching on what it means to have a planet in detriment and how that planet might operate in a bit of a unique way. So, if you missed any of those episodes when they first dropped, I definitely encourage you to go and have a listen and let me know what you think. So, my three favorite episodes were episode 30 on Pluto in Aquarius, episode 27 on astrology, health, and herbal teas, and episode 24, Working with a Planet in Detriment, on Venus in Scorpio. So there's a few highlighted episodes from the last year, and maybe you have a personal favorite from that list, or maybe you have a personal favorite show that I didn't mention, in which case, let me know in the comments below. So, with those first year show highlights shared, what I want to share now is a few of the things that I've learned over the past 12 months from having a podcast, how I approached it, how things started, how things are going now. There were a few things that I changed along the way that I want to tell you a little bit about why I did that and what I've noticed as a result. So, the first thing that I've learned, and in some ways I knew this already, but I really felt affirmed in this through doing the podcast, and that is to do things your own way, to do things in a way that feels comfortable for you or feels manageable for you. And specifically in terms of doing the podcast, before I started the show, I did a huge amount of research. I talked to some professional people in the podcast space, people who work on the back end of other podcasts. I talked to friends who had podcasts to really try and clarify what I was going to do with a podcast and how I was going to do it. And every single person that I spoke to, whether they were on the front end, the back end, whatever connection they had to podcasting, everybody told me that if you want it to be a success, you have to do a weekly show. Now, when I first heard that piece of information, and I heard it consistently for an extended period of time, and I kept, I freaked out. When I first heard it, I freaked out, and I kept noticing a lot of resistance because doing a weekly show sounded like a huge amount of work. I have been full-time as a professional astrologer for over 20 years. I have worked hard, and I'm very lucky. I have a full practice. I have a beautiful group of students that I teach astrology to. I have new practitioners that I mentor. So I was like, a weekly show sounds like just something I'm not sure that I have the time, energy, or capacity for. So I was quite resistant to that. And in fact, knowing that that was going to be a really important piece meant that I didn't jump in right away. I really took my time. I did sit with my resistance to this, and different people just kept saying it and saying it. People I respected, people who had a lot of industry expertise. And so instead of being resistant, after I let that piece of my response calm down, I started to reflect on and maybe ask myself the question, how could I do a weekly show? Like, what kind of offering could I do that might be simple enough, easy enough that I could get it out each week? And the first thing that I thought of was to do an audio only show. I know that in the podcast space, it's primarily audio. It certainly has been for a long time. But I also know that putting a podcast on YouTube is really helpful. And of course, YouTube loves a video. But I thought for me, if I'm really going to do this each week, how can I make it as simple and as easy as possible? So when I finally did come to start the podcast, I did opt to stick with audio only. I thought I'm just going to take one layer of like stress and extra things to organize as I'm getting into this groove of this extra weekly thing. And so it wasn't until October, 4 months after I started the show, that I began recording in video as well. And if you're listening on places like Apple or Spotify or Amazon, you're probably just expecting audio and that's what you've been getting. But if you're listening on YouTube, you will remember that in the first few months of the podcast, we just had a photo, like a still graphic, and you could just hear the audio track going over. I really wanted to keep things as simple as I could for myself in the beginning. And in some ways, what I was thinking about was reducing my own barriers to entry, if you will. And so taking out that piece of having to fuss with the background, of thinking about my appearance, of sorting out the camera angle and the lighting, just taking all of that visual component out really made it easier for me to get started. It also gave me some space to get comfortable with the hard podcasting, which is really the process of talking to myself into a microphone every week. And so I really focused on that. And once I got into a groove of doing this weekly format, I got in the groove of like scheduling this, every week or doing 2 episodes every couple of weeks, getting it recorded, getting my notes together, getting things up online. Once I was kind of comfortable with the mechanics of doing the weekly process, then I decided I would try adding in the video. And it was definitely weird to be sharing a podcast on YouTube, for instance, with no video. But I really wanted to stick with the regularity of the weekly drop of an episode more than anything else. And that just made it easier as I got started. I haven't looked back since I've added in the video, and I really believe that giving myself the time to get used to different parts of the podcasting experience, with whatever time I needed for that was really helpful. And I mention this in case you too are thinking about starting a podcast, or maybe you're thinking about starting something else and you're really worried about every little detail. It's okay to opt out of some of the things, especially as you're getting started. So, because I knew that doing the weekly thing was going to be important, because I knew that a podcast was primarily about having something interesting to listen to with reasonably decent sound, I decided to just do that in the beginning. And so once I felt comfortable with that, then I could evolve and add in the video. And so, what you may take from that is it's okay to start with the basic version and then make it more complex or visually interesting as you go. And that came up a lot for me around the podcast, because the next piece I'm going to talk about also has that visual element. And that is about the importance of a great podcast graphic. So, about 6 months after the show started, I realized that it might be time to get a better, more like high quality looking podcast graphic. And what I mean by the podcast graphic is, that little square image that shows up on your podcast feed, whether you've searched for the podcast or whether you're like listening in the podcast feed, there's a square like tile image. Whether you're on Spotify or Apple or Amazon, you will see all the podcasts have these, really lovely looking graphics. And what I started with was a very simple text-based image, which literally said Kelly's Astrology Podcast on a simple pink background. That's what I started with because, again, reducing barriers to entry, it was good enough to get started. But after 6 months, I thought maybe I could make that look a little bit more professional, or I could, zhuzh it up a bit. So I looked around at a bunch of other great podcast graphics. So podcasts that I like listening to, just things that I found really visually interesting. I found scrolling through podcasts on Apple really helpful for this. And then I shared some of the layouts and some of the kind of composition features that I really liked. I shared that with a designer that I work with. She worked her magic. We went through a couple of iterations, and that's how we've ended up with the graphic that I have now, which kind of has, the zodiac wheel behind. It's got some text. But the biggest change that we made to that podcast graphic is we stuck a photo of me on it, because I realized that making sure people knew that this Kelly's Astrology Podcast was me, this Kelly, because there are a lot of Kellys doing astrology, would be helpful for people who were looking for me specifically. So that was the biggest change we made. And in hindsight, I'm a bit like, that's a no-brainer. Why would I have not done a graphic that had my face on it in the beginning? But as I said, simple things to get things going and then improve along the way. And so that was the biggest change. Of course, this one is, got a lot more composition elements that are a little bit high level, but that was a huge piece to have my face on the graphic. There was another tweak that I made that was a little bit more technical around the same time, to do with the artist's name inside the data of the podcast show, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But those two things, changing the graphic and this technical shift around the name, really helped new people find the podcast, and even people who knew about me from classes or having consults together or workshops. They were suddenly able to connect me, who they've worked with in other spaces, to this particular Kelly's Astrology podcast. And so that was something that I, would encourage you, if you're thinking about a new offering that you're putting together, whether it's a podcast or a workshop or something else, don't be shy about sharing your face in it. It really helps add a personal element from like a marketing perspective. And I think people really connect with the essence of you through the image of you. And so that's why I think images can be really helpful in this space. And so it is totally okay to start really simple or affordable or small, like I did. It was just text on a pink background. And then once we were kind of set up and running with the show, then I started thinking about, tweaking things. And this was one of the things we changed. So back to that, getting technical about the podcast artist and the podcast name. So one of the things you do when you set up a podcast, inside your host, so I use Spotify for podcasters to host the podcast, and then the podcast is sent out via our RSS feed to places like Apple or Amazon, where you can just go straight into Apple Podcasts and you will find, my podcast, or you could be in Amazon where they have a podcasting branch now, and you could find my podcast in there. And so when we set up the podcast in the host, we had the name of the podcast, Kelly's Astrology Podcast, and we just used that as both the kind of title of the podcast, but also the name of the artist. So everything was just Kelly's Astrology Podcast. And one of the reasons, just on the name for a second, I chose something, again, really simple, Kelly's Astrology Podcast, which tells you that this is a podcast about astrology by someone named Kelly. And I always think when you have a choice, when you're naming something, that being really simple and clear is the best way to go. There's a lot of like fun, alliteration or rhymes that you can bring in. And if you can do that and still be clear, great. But I would go for clarity and simplicity over like fun if I had the choice. Now, I'm sure there are lots of other names that I could have used, but I really just wanted to keep it simple. And again, I just wanted to have something to get started that was going to be clear, long term. That wasn't going to limit me in terms of what I had to do. It's about astrology. And of course, there's many, many topics that the show could be about. So that was the simplicity choice of the name. And then we're setting up the podcast in all the technical back end places. And we just said Kelly's Astrology Podcast, and it's by Kelly's Astrology Podcast. But maybe the Kelly's Astrology Podcast is by Kelly's Astrology as the artist. And so a few months after the show began, this was probably late 2023-ish, I thought, why don't I just go and check out, do I have any reviews on Apple? What are people saying about the podcast? What do people think, for instance, as a way of just gauging response? And there were so many lovely comments in the Apple reviews, which was really, really beautiful to read. It was kind of affirming. And so that was great. That was a lovely little kind of motivation bump. There was one comment, though, that really got me thinking. Someone had mentioned that they were enjoying the show, but when they searched by my name, the podcast didn't come up. And that got me thinking. Because I've been practicing as an astrologer for more than 20 years, some of you know me by my name, Kelly Surtees. And in fact, my website URL used to be Kelly Surtees Astrology, or maybe it was just Kelly Surtees for many years. So some of you know me as, Kelly Surtees Astrology or astrologer. And some of you, maybe we've known each other more recently. You'll just know me kind of by my website URL, which is now Kelly's Astrology. So kellysastrology.com. And when this person made their comment, I realized that I had completely forgotten to include Kelly Surtees anywhere in the podcast. Now, if you're starting out new and you don't have people that have known about you for a long time via a different name, this may not be a thing. But for me, it felt another one of those things of, oh gosh, why didn't I think about that already? And so we went into the back end data of the podcast and I changed the artist from Kelly's Astrology to Kelly Surtees Astrology. And that meant that both of those options, the proper name of the podcast, which is Kelly's Astrology Podcast, and my name, Kelly Surtees Astrology, would become searchable data points for the show. So now, if you're in Apple, for instance, and you're in Apple Podcast and you search, whether you search Kelly's Astrology or Kelly Surtees, my podcast will come up as an option. And so that was really important. It seems like a small thing, but people searching for you and not finding you, searching for you by a name or a phrase that it makes sense that they would associate with you and then not finding you, that was a really useful comment that person left. And as a result of that comment, that's what led to changing the graphic to make it really clear about who I was. And it also led to changing that back-end data in the podcast. And so between updating the graphic and then updating that name data, there has been a very noticeable uptick in people listening to the show. For instance, within a couple of weeks of the new graphic going up and the extra, word, which is really just adding in Surtees, my surname, there has been, from within a couple of weeks of those changes being made, it was very noticeable that there were an extra 20 to 25% people listening to the show. So when you're on the back end of your podcast, you can see how many people listen to each show each week. And I could see the numbers make quite a big jump up at that point. So that was really interesting. Maybe there was some other, factors that contributed to that at that point. The things that I knew we did that changed that happened around the same time were the graphic and that technical back-end piece. So hopefully that's not too overwhelming in the data, but it is really interesting. And if you're searching for other people, with techniques or healing modalities or practitioners and you're not finding them, maybe just tweak your search phrase because they may well be there and just not showing up. So some interesting kind of, deep dive down the rabbit hole on the little technicalities in the back end. Another thing that I really learned is because it's something that I thought about and it's something I hear other people thinking about if they're wanting to do like podcasts. I hear this a lot also about blogging. So this piece may be helpful. This next piece may be helpful in both spaces. It's about the topic and the theme versus the consistency. So for me, I was planning to do a weekly show, and I thought the easiest thing to share would be to talk about some astro timing event or feature for the week ahead. I already do loads of weekly timing with astrology, and most of that is exclusively inside my Astrology Guide membership. So it was going to be fairly easy to use research I already had just to pick out one theme and make that the podcast for the week ahead. I also thought that as listeners, this might be really useful for you to have in terms of understanding the astrology and the energy of the moment. So what is the astrology of the week ahead? What is the energy of the week ahead? And that might help support you in managing your own life with more awareness. And that seems to have been the case because many of you are listening and then coming back. And I can see that every week and every month, there are more and more people finding the show, which I really appreciate. Ultimately, podcasting is fun for me, but it's really about giving you something that's helpful for you. So I really appreciate that you're enjoying the show and getting something out of it. So that's been a really great piece to do. Now, sharing about timing in astrology, that's a huge part of what I do in client work. So in one-on-one consults with astrology clients, the majority of the work I do is timing or forecasting in its nature. And so it's very natural for me to share that kind of material here as well. So I really did want to maybe play to my strengths or go into a space that I was already comfortable with in terms of the content each week or the topic each week. But the other thing that I'm thinking about and that I had thought about then, I'm thinking more about now, is that I know many of you have your own birth chart and you want to better understand your chart. So, one thing that I plan to try out in this second year of the show is mixing up the episodes a little bit so that there are some episodes that are about how to understand your birth chart, different aspects or different placements that you might have in your chart. And there are some episodes that are about timing and weekly insight. From a creative perspective, this will mean that some of the shows that I share will have a longer shelf life than the 7 days in question. And that kind of appeals too, that I might be able to create or offer something that is of interest to people over a longer period of time. And I'm not sure that there is a right approach in terms of the correct topic or theme. I kind of went with timing because that's a space that's comfortable and familiar. For me, it's always been something I've gravitated to in astrology from back in my very early days in astrology class, um, back in the late 90s, a long time ago. And so I don't know if there is like a right thing to do for topics. I think going to something that is a place of ease or interest for you, whether you're thinking about a podcast or a blog or a newsletter, I would definitely suggest that. But what I have seen make a huge difference is being consistent with sharing an episode every week. And that is a big commitment, but it is a great way to help people find the show and to get into the groove of tuning in regularly. So, my sense is that the consistent part of doing something every week is probably the more important piece than exactly, the topic or the theme, whether it's mixed up a bit, whether it's the same. And so whether you are thinking about a podcast or a blog or some other kind of information-based offering that you want to share, thinking about what kind of regular pattern you want to share that information on. Is it a weekly episode on your podcast? Is it a weekly blog on your website? Is it a weekly email on your, out to your email list? I think the key is that doing it regularly on a pattern that other people can rely on is what builds some consistency. And then that also helps to build trust and you're building a relationship with people in that way. And so I would worry less about the exact topic and more about, is it reasonable that I can do this weekly, or is it more reasonable that I can do it every 2 weeks? Or is it more reasonable that doing something monthly is what's going to work for me? And if you think back to the very first thing I shared, like do things your way or do things in a way that works for you, you get to choose if weekly or monthly or fortnightly, as we say in Australia, which is every 2 weeks, you get to choose the pattern that works for you. And all you have to do once you make that choice is stick to it, is to keep that agreement, if you like, with your listeners or with your readers. So, the final thing that I want to share about what I've learned over a year of podcasting, and this is very different just in terms of my own inner space coming to podcasting now after a year, is to have fun. One thing it took me a little while to realize, but I definitely got there before the end of the first year, was that if I'm going to make something a part of my weekly schedule, I want to make it enjoyable. And so I worry less about the perfect kind of iteration or version of things and more I focus more on the energy of what I want to share and of my energy being in a great space when I come to record for you. Podcasting is not something, for me at least, that has a direct fee associated with it. So I don't charge you a fee to listen, for instance. Many of you are just listening wherever you are, on a free podcasting platform, and you're just enjoying the show. And really, I'm so happy that you do. That's the whole point of something like this. Some of you will listen, and maybe after listening, you think, oh, I want a little bit more of astrology from Kelly. And you might sign up for an astrology course, you might join the membership, or you might come along to an in-person workshop or astrology event of some kind. And so there is a way that the podcast serves as a marketing tool, maybe as a kind of branding thing to help people get to know me and get to know my style of astrology. I know that like I have dear friends and some of my family who listen to the show each week, which is really affirming for me. And it's lovely to think that people I know are just getting a little bit more astro each week. But there's also many of you who I've never met and may never met. And it's really heartwarming to think that something I'm sharing might be helpful for you, it might be inspiring for you, it might be creating a sense of understanding or even peace for you, giving you a different bit of context. So for me, podcasting is kind of like it comes with all those rewards rather than something that like you sit down and you're going to, get some cash to pay the mortgage or pay a bill or what have you. And so it's not doing this podcasting for me is not like other things that I might do where there's a time money kind of a relationship. And that's absolutely fine. I never really expected the podcast to be a monetary thing. And I just love the freedom and flexibility that I feel that I have because it's sort of this offering that comes out each week. And based on all of that, I was like, I don't have to worry about like the getting it right or the being serious. Of course, I want to share good quality information. I want to make sure the sound is clear and easy for you to listen to. And that is, if I'm doing that, then fantastic. And I've really been amazed at how I've come to enjoy offering these weekly shows, these kind of weekly astro digests. And I figured ultimately that the more fun it is for me, the more I'm doing this in a way that is enjoyable and has a smoothness for me, then the more enjoyable it will be for you on the listening end. So, there are a few things that I've learned and kind of reflected on and come to understand about myself and about doing this kind of work over the past 12 months, doing this solo podcast show. I really do want to say a huge and heartfelt thank you again to you for listening and for being a part of the journey. So many of you have subscribed, left a review, followed along, and that has been so affirming to think, oh, wow, there is a few people out there that are enjoying the show. And that is very encouraging when you're kind of sitting by yourself, talking into a microphone to sort of get those reminders that people are enjoying it and kind of keep going. It's like a lovely nudge in the onwards direction. If you did miss any of those featured episodes that I mentioned at the start of the show, please do go and check them out. I will link to them all in the show notes below, or you can, of course, search, episode 40 or episode 27, wherever you are listening. And of course, if you are enjoying the show, please consider leaving a review. I would really appreciate that. For now, everyone, I will say thanks again for listening. Take care, and I will be back next week to share even more. Bye for now.